Song of Mornius, Chapter 42. Florina tensed as the tunnel forked ahead. Somewhere at the end of the right passage splashed the river. Clearly now she could hear it, crashing wild through the bones of the mountain. She slowed behind Tarek as he stopped where the tunnel widened. Then she moved past him, ignoring the scathing glances from Lieutenant Roth. As she passed him, she saw Tarek grimace, then turn away to converse with his men. Avalar went to poke her head down the tunnels, first one, then the other, her long blonde braid swinging over her left shoulder. She scowled to herself. Old magic. Florina heard her mutter. Water, down this way. She nodded to the right. Yes. Florina approached the giant. The ghost's helpful green light was gone from their midst. How she wished now for her blazonstone staff to help her see, but the staff that joined Melian with the Vealer was long gone. Only Mornius lighted her way now, with Galen holding the staff, while the ghost conducted his own affairs far away from their sight. Avalar glanced down. You know this place? She asked. What is your counsel? Florina shrugged, privately taken aback that the giant would even deign to ask. She nodded to the right. My pool gets its water from somewhere. I'm guessing the river is its source, from down that way. But my pool's higher up. Tilting her head, Florina glanced upward at the glistening black, low-hanging ceiling. It's closer to the surface, so I don't really know. These tunnels here aren't used. Of course not, said Avalar. Why would they be? All your giants are dead. Florina backed from the giant's sudden ire. We don't enslave giants, she said, ever. There are lots of things I regret doing, but we never kept slaves. Pardon me? Avalar swung from the tunnel to face her. What are the Vealermen? Enough, Avalar. Tarek pushed between them. With a gesture, he motioned for Galen to shine Mornius down the mouths of the two different tunnels. Florina started as he caught her behind the neck, gripping her firmly. Which one, Florina? With his hand, he pulled her before him, positioning her firmly behind Mornius's light. To get where we can strike a blow, which one would be the better? Florina trembled. His gritty fingers felt hard and unfeeling on her neck, as Method Men's had been, while he held her down and repeatedly took her immobilized body. Without warning, her knees folded. She slumped, trembling, to the floor. Behind her, the chamber went silent. Leather creaked as Tarek turned. She heard him speak softly to the giant. Avalar crouched, caught her gently by the arm, and helped her up. Eyes closed, Florina clung to the giant's arms. Through the fall of her hair and washout of her tears, she could see Tarek's face, his quiet eyes staring at her. She has already told me, said Avalar softly. The right tunnel would be the best. Florina nodded agreement through her tears. Avalar's arms held her, supported her as she struggled for control. Then Tarek caught her gently below her chin and lifted her head. Why didn't you just say so, Florina? I don't like to be grabbed like that, Florina blurted. Furious at herself now for her own weakness, she scrubbed at her cheeks with the heel of her hand. With his hands, Tarek smoothed her hair back from her eyes to better see what she tried to hide, her unending brokenness and shame. I'm sorry, he told her softly. I'll remember. He gestured to the rest. Let's get going. Florina stiffened as a hand fell across her shoulder. She looked up through her tears into the giant's face. Stay back here with me, Avalar said. Unable to resist, Florina turned, allowing the giant to manipulate her, draw her gently against the wall. Let the others go ahead, urged the giant. You and I will take up the rear. You have clung to Leader Tarek long enough. He will need his arms for battle when it comes. Florina stood rigid against the stone, watching Tarek enter the tunnel. She fought to replay his words in her head, how he suspected the giant too only felt rage rather than hate. Behind Tarek followed the two guards slowly, Silva with a streak of black down the side of his forehead, and Dren, his face permanently fierce because of his scar. She blinked when Björgen stopped before her. Reaching out, he touched hard, calloused fingers to her cheek. "It'll get better, my dear," he said gruffly. "Tarek's a good man." She nodded and looked away, blinking hard at the floor at her feet. With a sigh and an upward glance to the giant, he moved past her, quickening his pace to remain in the staff's blue light. "I still say should have left you dead," came Roth's hard whisper. "Next time we rest, I wouldn't sleep too soundly if I were you." Florina continued to nod woodenly as Kevin Roth stomped by. She had nothing to tell the young man, nothing of value to say. It was true that she deserved death. Cameron Florin had been her friend. Nithra had been her father. Numbly she stared at the floor. "Let us follow," Avalar said softly from above her head. Florina, still nodding, jerked herself from the wall and thrust herself into the darkness after the men. She was too tired to resist, tired of pain and guilt and tears. Almost Tarek's kindness wounded her more. It reminded her of the dear friend she had in him and lost, a man who had very much loved her. Her nerves were on fire, her body trembling. In a daze she tottered at the giant's side, her knees shaking, tremors clenching her muscles. A pressure was mounting in her chest. She couldn't get air, couldn't fill her hungry lungs fast enough. "Easy," soothed the giant. "Florina Vlin, stop. Look at me." She obeyed at once, leaning over her knees as she struggled for air. The tunnel went black ahead as Galen, with his staff, rounded a dusty corner. She felt the giant's hand grip her shoulder to steady her. "Whoever hurt you is gone," Avalar said. "No," Florina groaned. "We're going straight for him. He's what we have to fight. His teeth and claws, it'll strip the skin from living bones. The man who hurt me," she clenched back a sob, "was only his pet." Avalar paused for a moment, letting the tunnel's silence calm her. From a distance she could hear the men's soft voices, the faint clanging of Roth's machete against stone. "So we fight him," the giant said evenly, "and he shall die. Or mayhap we shall die. Either way there will come an end." Florina sank down onto her heels, her right arm straight out, hand braced against the tunnel's wall. The thought of men's unraveled her, brought back memories of her helpless, agonized silence, of his slow, cruel torture. "He raped me," she whispered to no one. With her free hand she covered her face, pressed the burning behind her lids hard to stop her tears. She broke off and stared into the quiet darkness. Only when her lantern blazed beside her bed would he appear to work on her, waiting first until she was helpless, immobilized completely by his magic, unable even to cry out. Now she could cry, but it would delay the man she loved who was trying so hard to be kind, and this giant beside her who struggled not to hate. She could hear Avalar's soft breathing above her head. "I know not this word, rape," Avalar said softly. Then she roused herself. "Florina, come." Florina looked toward the voice. "You should hate me," she said. "I loved Cameron. He and Tarek. We were children together, played together. He trusted me and I killed him. All for a god who destroyed everything I loved." Florina Vlin, Avalar's big hand clasped her wrist, enveloped it completely. She climbed to her feet and stumbled forward, leaning into the hand Avalar slid under her arm. But again her knees were folding. She sagged and started to fall. Avalar caught her. She felt herself being lifted, cradled. Blindly she turned her head, thrust her face against the giant's strong heart. "I'm sorry," she groaned. Like a child, she bunched the giant's filthy tunic between her fingers. "I'm so sorry." For a time she drifted, lulled by a feeling of calm, of a safety she remembered only from her childhood, in the circle of her mother's soft arms. Lights flashed far ahead. Against her hand she felt the giant's heart quicken. Avalar surged forward, trotted half erect beneath the tunnel's black stone. "There's a hole in the ceiling," she heard Jürgen's older voice say in the distance. "Tarek, take a look. There's another tunnel. It's right above us." Yes, Florina nodded, remembering the endless overlapping tunnels and rooms of Malian's temple. She saw for an instant a midnight head thrusting itself down at her from the ceiling, black jaws parting wide from a lolling tongue of rippling fire, dripping hot, splattering acid over her face. Cool fingers touched her forehead, rousing her fully. She blinked her eyes, thrashed away from the fire. Then Avalar slowed. Stopping behind Galen, the giant set her down. Florina stumbled forward past the staff wielder. Jürgen, holding a torch in his hand, flicked her a glance as she came alongside. With a grimace, he thrust its fire upward into the hole. "It's just another old tunnel," she said, staring up. She rubbed hard at her eyes and looked again. "We don't use the ones this low, but it'll get us closer. We have to keep climbing. Malian's, it's all higher up. So we're taking the back way in." Grinning, Jürgen nodded. "Good girl," Tarek said behind her. "Roth, how about giving me a boost?" Florina glanced at Avalar, saw the giant, her height already putting her head above the ceiling, studying the new tunnel's contours. "Not just up," Avalar said softly, glancing toward Tarek, "but to the river. I remember how, when the Black Sword sang, 'Only to me,' the words it sang, 'To freedom goes the river.'" Tarek stepped into Roth's hand and seized the edges of the opening above. "Then to the river," he said quietly, "we shall go." He scrambled up, and then, after a pause, returned to the opening. Florina held her breath as she went next. Tarek grabbed at her arms, raising her from the giant's grasp. Trembling, she backed away as he released her. Then she turned. Jürgen had tossed the torch up after Tarek to brighten the tunnel. Now it lay on the stone, smoke-heavy as the flames licked at the dampness. Huddled against the wall, she flicked her gaze back and forth nervously, staring hard through the curls of smoke into the blackness on either side. Then she stiffened. As Tarek leaned over to peer back down, Florina opened her mouth, struggled for words. Stumbling backward, she stared as four large creatures skulked from the swirling dark, their lips drawn back from their needle-sharp teeth, their skull-like faces grinning. These were creatures she knew, servants of Malian she had helped create. Leaping forward, the largest of the Veelermen seized her face, slapped its bony hand over her mouth. She writhed and kicked, fighting to scream against its grasp. Tarek heard her. She watched him whirl and snatch out a sword she hadn't seen before, what looked to be a blade of ancient metal. Hissing, her attacker's companions leapt past her with their blades drawn. Talons curved around the black hilts of their crude swords. Slowly they advanced, poison dripping from spines, bristling from their vertebra, their lumpy tails lashing the stone. Florina bared her teeth. She bit hard into the palm of the creature holding her, harder still until her mouth filled with blood. The creature screeched and its grip loosened. With a howl of her own, she tore herself free. "Tarek!" yelled Roth beneath the tunnel. He scrambled through the hole, rolled sprawling at Tarek's feet. Reaching down, Tarek seized him by his jerkin and yanked him back from the advancing swords. Evading her captor, Florina rushed forward. Roth and Tarek hammered with their weapons, clashing steel against steel. A Veelerman caught at Tarek and threw him back. Tail curling, it leaped to follow. Florina jumped over Deravan Silva as he was pulling himself up. She launched herself at Tarek's attacker, colliding with its scaly shoulder. With all her weight, she threw herself backward to unbalance the creature. It reeled, throwing her sideways as it swung around. A blow like a fist thrust her forward. It took her from behind, sliding cold and hard along her spine and through her stomach, then out from beneath her ribs, the steel dripping with her blood. Tarek's sword. The ancient blade she had seen him holding. Above her head she could see the familiar outline of the ghost watching, beheld the feral grin on Argus's face. She sagged over the steel, gasping in shock and pain. Before her eyes, Silva grabbed at the Veelerman, rammed a dagger through its throat. Then slowly she began to fall. "Florina!" Tarek grabbed for her shoulder with his left hand, the hilt of his weapon with his right. Gently he eased her down, using his torso to cushion her as she slumped bonelessly against him. "Hang on!" he shouted. "Avalar, get Galen up here now!" "Tarek!" She clung to him, leaning away from her hurt. She glimpsed his face, his stricken look of horror. Her legs were heavy now, numb as they splayed to one side. She was shaking, and so very cold. "Tarek," she gasped. "Tarek?" She gagged on blood, staring as the tunnel faded to white. Then it was Cameron sinking beside her to one knee, Cameron cupping her face between his hands. She stared at his freckled nose, his soft and humane brown eyes filling with tears. He leaned over. She closed her eyes as he kissed her forehead. She shivered as she felt his fingers caress her lips, the trembling curve of her jaw. She moved her mouth, struggling to form words. Staring into her eyes, he smiled gently. "I need you to live," he murmured. She blinked hard, or was it just a kiss of air she felt on her face, flowing over her cheek and above her ear? A crackling explosion dragged her backward, ripped her from Cameron's touch. She struggled as Galen dropped to her side. Power burned from the skystone, flashed from his hands. "No!" Sobbing, she reached out her arms toward the face she could no longer see. "No, Cameron! Don't go!" Fire struck at the blade, driving the steel tip back through. Farina held her breath as needles pricked through her, jabbed at her insides, her nerves, and her bones. The sword clattered on the stone behind her back. Argus's sword. Tarek kicked it aside, flashed a hard look of outrage upward at the ghost knight, and then pulled her close. Beside her, Galen lowered the staff. Eyes closed, teeth visibly clenched, he leaned over, his whole body shuddering. "Galen!" Reaching out, Tarek slapped his staff away. As the skystone darkened, he caught at Galen's shoulder. "It's enough, Galen," Tarek said. "She's healed." Galen nodded and slumped to the floor. Florina lay in shock, staring at the low ceiling. "He must still be in me," she whispered. "Malian, he knows I'm here." Tarek was silent as she leaned back against him, his left arm around her middle, his right clamped over her forehead. "Forget Malian," he said after a pause. "Don't talk, Farina. Let me think." For a long moment she lay relieved and limp in his grasp. Then she stiffened. Without knowing why, she started to struggle. He released her as his men came stumbling back down the tunnel. Roth bumped along the wall, his face ashen, blood spurting from the arm he held. Half severed below the shoulder, it flopped in his grasp with every step he took. At once, Galen surged to his feet and hurried toward him. Avalar pulled her upper torso through the opening. Arms braced, she glared at her surroundings, at a new passage filled with potential memories she wanted no part of. Slowly she dragged her hips over the edge and sat, her legs hanging down. "Sails," Farina heard her mutter. "What am I doing to myself?" Standing, Farina stared at her, at the damp, red exhaustion beneath the giant's eyes. Somehow Avalar kept her past at bay, her ghosts silent, but it shortened her temper, enough that she now glowered defiance at the empty air. Without conscious thought, Farina drifted toward her. "Farina!" Tarek's voice stopped her, warned her. She turned where she stood and he gestured at the floor. "Sit. You've lost a lot of blood. I want you to rest." Trembling, Farina lowered herself again to the floor. She leaned on one leg, stretched the other out before her. Across the tunnel, Galen slumped to his knees. His eyes were closed, his face deathly pale. She stared up at Roth with his torn, bloody shirt, watched the young man examine his healed shoulder. "It's my fault," she said softly. "Malian knows I'm here." "He knows we're all here, Farina." Tarek glared at the blade he carried, at the streaks of her blood on the steel. "It doesn't matter. I want to know why you said my brother's name." Tarek dragged his head up to stare pointedly at her. "I heard how you called to him." She shivered and lifted her bent knee, hugging it tightly to her chest. You won't believe me. You'll just get angry. He sighed. I'm too tired to get angry. Just tell me. She looked at him, at his eyes capable of so much. Once he had loved and laughed with those eyes, but now it was her doing, all because of her. She turned her head, averted her gaze. I saw Cameron right here. She nodded to the stone near the opening in the floor. When I was wounded, he came to kneel beside me. Her eyes filled with tears, kissed my forehead. Her tears dropped hot on the back of her grimy hand and rolled off. Numbly she stared at the crisscrossed patterns they made over her knuckles and down around her wrist. I didn't want him to go, she whispered. Neither did I, said Tarek softly. He leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. Virgen, standing behind the seated giant, dug through her pack. He tossed a rag onto Tarek's lap, then foraged deeper. We need food, he grumbled to himself. Ross Dyrradell before that meat goes bad. Avalar, where? Oh, never mind, here. Quickly he dumped various smaller sacks to the floor and then brought out the vessel that contained their water. The Dyrradell's stomach sloshed and gurgled as he handed it to Roth. You first, Lieutenant. Drink your fill. Then you take next, Lady Vlen. We need rest, not just food, Tarek mumbled. I feel like we've been going for days now. With a sigh, he raised the sword from his lap and picked up the crumbled cloth.